Well, welcome back. This is the second electronic lecture that we've done, video lecture for IS 430, and it's talking about privacy. We're going to cover as much as we can in privacy. This is actually an area of specialty for me. Much of my dissertation research and much of my career as an academic has been focused on privacy issues and how they are different from security issues and the regulatory implications of trying to maintain privacy. So I'll be giving a little bit more detail on some of this stuff than you will see in the textbook. That said, the chapter in the textbook is actually very good. This is one of the main reasons why I selected this textbook over some of the alternatives that you would see for similar courses at other universities. The Flieger textbook does have a nice chapter on privacy that does cover all the basics. That said, this is another one of those topics in a survey course that can actually expand to an entire semester-long course, and in fact I have taught an entire course at the graduate level on privacy here at UMBC, and I hope to bring that back sometime in the future when I can. Hard to predict what's going to happen now with all of the stuff that's going on, so we'll just stay as focused as we can on privacy issues in this one lecture. All right, so here's the objectives of what we're going to try and cover today. The first and most important thing that we will do is try and define privacy and some of the fundamental concepts and challenges related to privacy for computing. This is a very difficult thing for a lot of people to wrap their heads around. Probably the most important thing we'll do. Then we'll cover some of the laws and technologies, maybe the history of law and technology as it relates to privacy, because privacy regulation is much more important than security regulation. Companies typically have an incentive to improve their own security simply for the sake of their own preserving their own intellectual property. And then consumers, almost as a byproduct, benefit from that. That is not actually the case with privacy. We'll talk about actual use of the web, privacy precautions you can take with web surfing and email, and some other technologies and emerging concerns like electronic voting near the end of the lecture. Okay, so normally I would have everyone very quickly write down their own definition of privacy, as concise as they possibly can. I would encourage you, if you're watching this on a video, to take a moment, pause the video, and write down a definition of privacy. It's sort of like the way that you would explain privacy casually in a conversation. It doesn't have to be super technical, but it should be your definition, the way that you think about privacy. All right, well, moving on, after you've written that down, common definitions of security, note security not privacy, include these sentiments, right? Protecting from the possibility of harm, the notion of feeling safe or not having fear or anxiety, maybe active measures that are taken to guard against attacks or things like that. The notion of resilience or resistance in the face of some sort of danger, the ability to address or respond or fight back to some kind of attack. These are common sentiments in just lay persons describing what security means to them. For computing, though, we have to be more specific, especially if you want to formalize security primitives. And we introduced very early on in the semester the security triad, the CIA: confidentiality, integrity, and availability. And this is essentially the definition that most computing professionals will use, or at least fall back on, for security. Fairly widely accepted, fairly well understood. And you can see some elements of the common sort of casual definitions of security in this more formal definition of security. The main thing I want to show, though, is that when we go from a common definition of security to a computing definition of security, we're not losing that much. That's not always the case with privacy. So here's some of the common definitions, or at least elements of common definitions for privacy. The first and most important here is this notion of controlling info that other people possess about you. Lots of common definitions about privacy include this sense of control. And you'll see that carry through to a lot of technologies. Another very common sentiment is that it's basically anything that's not public, so defining privacy essentially by highlighting the things that it is not. The ability to control information you want or don't want to share, so this is sort of like control over information, but only at the sharing level, not just sort of at the data level. Then there's also this notion of knowing how people are using your info, so just awareness of how your information is being used. The feeling that you can walk, talk, work, live without intrusion. This freedom from intrusion, this notion of being left alone, is another very common sentiment in privacy. And of course, some people will, being somewhat aware of privacy policies, think of privacy as just a way for companies to reduce their own liability, right? A lot of privacy policies are not really about protecting the stakeholder, but more about reducing liability for the company involved in using your data. Here's how computing definitions of privacy might incorporate some of those elements, right? There's far less agreement on this computing definition than there is on the computing definition for security. One approach that people have taken is sort of like this guarantee of plausible deniability based on some kind of an algorithm. Currently, differential privacy is the winner here. We've also talked briefly about k-anonymity and some of the changes that you make to k-anonymity to make it better. The same sort of idea, but not quite as strong in terms of what you can do from a computational standpoint. If you are looking for a equivalent to the triad, in privacy it is confidentiality, anonymity, and autonomy. Note that there is a little bit of overlap because confidentiality exists in both the security triad and here in the privacy triad. The problem is that a lot of computing professionals would not agree on these three things as the criteria you would want for privacy in a computing context. And also, what does anonymity mean? Is something like differential privacy's plausible deniability, does that count as anonymity, or is there something else that you would need in addition to that? What does autonomy look like? Does that mean that you need something equivalent to the GDPR's right to be forgotten, or is that not something you would consider part of autonomy? Those two pieces are a little bit harder to define definitively in a computing context. And then finally, you will see a number of privacy definitions in a computing context that require sort of non-computing policy-based mechanisms in addition to implementation and technology for computers, like data ownership or data control. Okay, so we'll highlight as much as we can, but the main takeaway here is that if you are just comparing computing definitions for security, right, confidentiality, integrity, and availability, versus computing definitions of privacy, you will find there's much, much less agreement on what privacy means from a computational standpoint. All right, so how should we define privacy? What are some of the other things that we might want to consider when we are building technologies that we want to protect privacy? Basically, there are three broad kinds of definitions that are used, and this is true in both a computing context and in a policy context. The first is this notion of a secrecy-based definition where information that's private basically just refers to information that nobody else knows about. It's just a secret. Second is the broad category of anonymity-based definitions. So this is the notion of privacy in public, where you might be in your car on the highway in a public space, but because no one really cares about what you're doing or who you are as a part of just traffic on the highway, you have this sort of protection, this obscurity of being just another driver in a car. In the same way, like if you're standing in the middle of New York Times, absent coronavirus pandemic type measures, there would be tons of people there and no one's really going to care if you're there picking your nose or doing whatever you're doing, right? Like no one is looking at you in particular in that particular instance. You're sort of obscured by the rest of the public that are out and about. And then finally, we have control-based definitions. This notion that your information is private in the sense that you should know what's happening with it, and you should be able to control whether or not people are able to do what they're currently trying to do with your information. So those are the three broad categories of definitions: secrecy, anonymity, and control-based. The textbook definition is the right to control who knows certain things about you. That's the one that the Flieger and Flieger textbook uses. I don't think this is particularly bad. It's certainly short. I think Jim Harper, who works at the Cato Institute, has a somewhat better definition in that privacy is a subjective condition people experience when they have the power to control information about themselves. The main difference here being that there's a subjective element and that privacy does actually mean different things to different people. Some people care quite greatly about healthcare privacy, for example, and they want to keep secret any potential concerns or conditions they may have that would have, at least to their perception, some kind of negative social perception if it were known publicly. Other people are much more open about healthcare concerns, and they want everyone to know as soon as possible so that those folks can interact with them more directly. And this doesn't really depend upon the concern. It could be that both of those individuals had been diagnosed with a form of cancer, or both of those individuals had, maybe they had the coronavirus that's going around, something like that. Some people want it to be known widely, and other people would rather just deal with it on their own in secret and not have it made public. All right. Finally, there are legal definitions. There are many different proposed legal definitions and lots of different active currently passed legislation that define privacy in particular ways. I wanted to at least highlight two because they're sort of interesting and they have implications for technology that are kind of unusual. The first is this notion that privacy can be thought of as a form of property, very similar to intellectual property. Can we just think of information as data that we own? This was proposed very, very early on, many years ago, by Pam Samuelson. And most legal scholars look at it now as a rather problematic approach to privacy regulation, that data ownership is generally not the route that you want to go. And we'll talk a little bit about that in the next section. The next definition is privacy as contextual integrity, and this has proven to be a little bit more popular with policy folks. It's essentially the notion that the context under which you reveal information about yourself has to be tied to that information in a way that's very important for privacy. So if you share information with Facebook, right, for the purpose of communicating to your relatives that maybe you've just become pregnant, right, to come up with a good example, and that you're planning on naming the kid in a few months and you're looking for suggestions of names, right, or something like that. That's the kind of thing where the context matters a lot. And if that information was sold to a third party, for example, Target or Amazon, for marketing purposes, it could be problematic, right? And you may not want the deluge of baby stuff that would be thrown your way from one of those large corporations that are trying to get access to what is essentially a huge windfall for them. So those are two legal definitions, things that we will want to consider as we move into the rest of this lecture on privacy.